I think that first of all we have to remember ourselves that the history of humanity is the history of migration in a way. So it's not unusual. Since the very beginning of humanity, people moved from one place to the other for different reasons. For ecological reasons, for security reasons, because they wanted a better future. So the history of humanity is the history of migration. There is nothing unusual about it. But of course, we are seeing in recent years the numbers go up. Why? Because the level of conflict, because of the impacts of climate change, because the lack of opportunity, especially for the younger generations in terms of access to jobs, access to proper education. So there are different drivers for migration. And I have to tell you that no one in his or her right mind would leave family, home, country, sometimes culture, language behind just because you want an adventure. You know, human beings are not like that. They have to leave because there are situations that threaten their lives and or their future. So, which means that migration is by nature a transboundary issue that needs a global response. I think first the United Nations, the members of the United Nations are 193 countries, and we have to be prepared and respect the sovereign right of a country to say, I will join this initiative, this treaty, this framework, or I will not join, and have that sovereign decision. So that has to be respected. But on the other hand, it is a pity that sometimes decisions are made because of a very aggressive campaign of misinformation about the content and the reach of the Global Compact. The Global Compact is not a legally binding instrument. It is a framework to encourage cooperation, exchange of best practices, and to provide some 23, policy guidance for people to consider, for countries to consider, according to their own national legislation, according to their national policy, and to their decision. So unfortunately, there was a big campaign, especially in the social media, creating, false messaging regarding the reach and the nature of the compact. And I think that sometimes, public opinion, they play a role, and they put a lot of pressure in their governments to say no, we say no. And unfortunately and painfully, sometimes people say no. There are countries or communities that are the outcome of a migration process themselves, and that at some point in history they were received by generosity by others. So with that said, I think that the Global Compact provides really a good framework, a good ground to encourage cooperation, to encourage exchange of information, to encourage exchange of good practices among countries, and to also burden sharing between countries of origin, of transit, and destination. So it is a useful tool, and it was unfortunate that perhaps this misinformation campaign happened, but also at some point, the sovereign right of countries that they're not ready to join. The numbers are very, very telling. If we look at last year, for example, more than almost 2,300 people died and disappeared just crossing the Mediterranean last year. So one life is already too much, and I think we have to do what we need to do to ensure that these people are protected under international law and under the already existing instruments, starting by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. climate change is perhaps one of the most pressing survival threats, against humanity. We have gone far in terms of adopting the UN Convention on Climate Change, adopting at the time the Kyoto Protocol, and now the Paris Agreement, which is a collective effort and collective commitment to reduce emissions and to work more on adaptation to climate change and to building resilient societies. So the frameworks are there, the convention is there, the Paris Agreement is there. In Poland, we were able to agree on a rule book, on a program of work to implement the Paris Agreement. But in spite of all these efforts, we need to really speed up action, because science, as you very well mentioned, and all the scientific reports are very pessimistic, saying that we are not performing well, that the emissions are increasing, that the possibilities of not being able to stop the increase of the temperatures in 1.5 degrees is not going to be, feasible if we continue with the same patterns of consumption and production, and our emission footprint continue to increase. So we need to really act quickly. Sometimes, some member states, they decided that they're not ready to join, this shared responsibility to combat climate change. But, there are also local governments, cities, individual states in the United States. And these individual states, these cities, there is a network of hundreds of cities within the United States that are willing to commit to delivering on the Paris Agreement. The package of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is a very strong package, because all the goals are interconnected. You cannot fight poverty and inequality if you don't have strong institutions, proper governance, and if you don't have proper partnerships in place. The same goes for water and sanitation. There is no way to have, societies that are sustainable, that give space and opportunities for everyone if you don't have, decent work. So they're all interconnected. You cannot comply with the 2030 agenda if you leave 50% of the population behind. That is the gender equality and the women's rights goal. So they're all interconnected, and the purpose is just to provide, a survival kit for humanity to plan and work towards societies that would be more sustainable, more equal, more inclusive, prosperous, with access to jobs for everyone. If we only think that to meet the 2030 agenda, we need to create 600 million new jobs, and that 70% have to be for the younger generations, it's a huge challenge. There is uneven progress. If you look at the numbers in terms of extreme poverty, in terms of access to jobs, equality in salaries, equal pay, equal job, the gap is about 20%. The same qualifications, the same job, 20% less salary because it is a woman. It continues to exist everywhere. Access of women to positions of power, of decision making. We still have a lot to do. If you look at the world, 193 member states, but only 20 female presidents in the entire world now. No, if you look at the proportion of women parliamentarians, I think it goes 22-23%. So there is still a lot of work to do. Rural women, indigenous women, if you look at the victims of climate change, vulnerability, the levels of vulnerability of women and girls in climate disasters are higher. If you look at violence, domestic violence, the victims in most situations, the majority of the situations are girls and women. They're, 1 out of 3 women in the world have or will be victims of violence. Sometimes it seems like we repeat and repeat ourselves over and over again, but it is needed. We need affirmative action. We need to work seriously for women's rights and women empowerment, and that's also one of my priorities this year. It is a false dichotomy, honestly, when you say something like it's either you take care of national interest in the interest of your people at the national level, or you look at the global scenario and you commit to join forces to solve the global problems. It's the either or. And the only way to solve the global challenges is through collective responsibility and through a multilateral framework, institutional framework, which is the house of multilateralism, is the UN. So I say it's a false dichotomy because you can do both. You can do both, of course. There are major issues at the national level. There is no other way to fight climate change if you don't have, a collective and shared responsibility and global leadership. Even if you translate this into very concrete national policies for adaptation and resilience at the national level. Is there any other way to combat, for example, terrorism, if it's not through international cooperation? We need to really come with a very strong narrative to say that the only way, the only venue, the only space to address global challenges that affect our people at the ground level is through, international multilateral action, global leadership, and collective responsibility. It doesn't mean that we're not facing a situation when we see exacerbated extreme nationalism, populism emerging in different parts of the world, and that is worrisome, of course. We have to be worried and concerned, but at the same time, we have to make our case. Be very clear on what is the value added that the United Nations brings to people. It's not an either or. I think it is a process that needs to bring all the parts of the UN together. This year we have a big challenge, which is to implement the 3-stream reform process, the management reform, the new development architecture, and also the new peace and security model. So the challenge this year is to implement the 3 pillars of the reform that was adopted by member states, proposed by the Secretary General. So that's a major challenge that we're facing. We're also working, very hard to have a meaningful outcome of the revitalization of the General Assembly. The General Assembly, as the Parliament of Humanity, has to deliver better. We have to be less bureaucratic and more to mainstream the work we do, to be very careful about complying and implementing the resolutions that we pass ourselves. Well, I think I have been very bold myself when I decided to establish 7 priorities for my work and to deliver on these 7 priorities. We have gone through some kind of moments of tension during my first 4 months of tenure regarding difficult issues. You have to really, take the lead and rule on the basis of what we have, the possibilities that the procedural limits provide, but decide on how to proceed about resolutions such as the Hamas resolution, about Palestine being appointed chair of the G77. I mean, you have to take these procedural decisions that are at the end are political decisions. and so you have full power to do that. In terms of delivering on the normative role of the General Assembly, you have to really work hard to make sure that all the 6 committees, they deliver with quality, they deliver on time. We passed 260 something resolutions this year. Every resolution requires a negotiation effort behind it, and so it's tremendous work. I had received more than 50 mandates as president of the General Assembly, and you have to deliver. And your work depends very much on the buy-in and the cooperation and the commitment of member states, of course. But you have to have a position of leading, of encouraging, of making sure that we reach consensus, and if we do not reach consensus, that there is a democratic exercise of voting. This is a very complex issue. I am not going to be naive about it. It is one of the most divisive issues in the House, and it requires the engagement and the political will of member states. That's obvious. And in that particular issue, you can lead and guide the process, but it's not wise, I would say, to replace the will of the House. The will of the House is the will of 193 countries that have very different views about how far we should go. My role as leader, as president of the General Assembly, is to ensure that a process, for the reform just continues in a transparent way, in an inclusive way, takes on board all the different views. But I think that my personal view on how to reform the Security Council really does not matter. I think that every campaign, every engagement, just to protect the principle of freedom of expression and freedom of press has to be valued. But regarding the response of the United Nations, I have to remind ourselves that there is a special rapporteur on freedom of expression that is part of the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. So the architecture is there. The special rapporteur exists. It has to provide reports to member states. There is the committee to protect journalists as well. This committee, gave us figures from last year that are really painful. 53 killings of journalists only in 2018. I would say that one is too many already. It should not happen. But for example, on the Khashoggi case, from the very beginning, I really called for an urgent, thorough and independent investigation. And as we know, Agnès Calamar from Canada she's the special rapporteur on executions. She has already completed the first part of her investigation, and I think that we should have, hopefully very soon, a complete report from her. So I think that sometimes we have to be careful to duplicate, and have this and that, but we do have the structure under the framework of the Human Rights Council, the special procedures. We have the Committee to Protect Journalists as well, and we have also public opinion, and you also have a very important role to play. You mentioned I didn't see myself, but the campaign from the Washington Post, for example, I think that we should all work together on this. And the UN, of course, is responding. The UN is not an abstract body. It's the member states and the Secretariat working together. And so I think that we are doing our share.